On Christmas Eve 1945, as snow fell gently across the rolling hills of West Virginia, the Castellano family home became a furnace that would burn not just wood and memory, but hope itself. What began as a night of holiday preparation would end as one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries, a case that would torment a family for decades and leave investigators with more questions than a human mind could bear. The two-story wooden farmhouse sat like a sentinel on a hill overlooking the small mining town of Fayetteville, its windows glowing warmly against the winter darkness. Inside, the scent of pine needles from the Christmas tree mingled with the aroma of traditional Italian cookies that Maria Castellano had been baking since dawn. Her husband, Giuseppe, had returned home from his trucking route earlier that evening, his weathered hands still cold from loading cargo in the December chill. Giuseppe Castellano had brought his family to West Virginia in 1923, fleeing the poverty of southern Italy with dreams of prosperity in America's coal country. 22 years later, those dreams had taken root. He owned a successful trucking business, employed several local men, and had built a life of modest comfort for his wife and 10 children. The Castellanos were known throughout Fayetteville as hard-working, God-fearing people who kept to themselves but never turned away a neighbor in need. That Christmas Eve, the house pulsed with the energy of a large family preparing for the holiday. The older children, Helen, 21, and James, 17, helped their mother in the kitchen while the younger ones played in the living room. Dorothy, 14, practiced piano carols while her younger siblings listened in rapt attention. The middle children, Louis, 12, Maurice, 9, and Martha, 8, had spent the afternoon stringing popcorn and paper chains, their laughter echoing through the rooms like music. The youngest, Betty, just 5 years old, had fallen asleep in her father's lap while he read from a worn Italian Bible, her dark curls catching the firelight from the hearth. The scene was one of perfect domestic tranquility, a snapshot of the American dream that Giuseppe had worked so hard to achieve. But even in this moment of peace, shadows gathered at the edges of their happiness. For months, Giuseppe had been receiving strange telephone calls. The voice on the other end spoke in broken English, sometimes Italian, always threatening. The caller knew details about Giuseppe's business, his roots, even the names of his children. Local authorities dismissed the calls as pranks, but Giuseppe felt a cold certainty in his bones. Someone was watching his family. The threats had begun shortly after Giuseppe refused to sell his trucking business to a syndicate of men who claimed to represent interested parties from back east. The meeting had taken place in a downtown diner, where 3 men in expensive suits had laid out an offer that was less negotiation than ultimatum. When Giuseppe politely declined, explaining that his business was his legacy to his children, the men exchanged glances that spoke of violence barely restrained. "You got a beautiful family, Mr. Castellano," the leader had said, his voice soft as silk but his eyes hard as coal. "Be a real shame if something happened to disturb your peace." Giuseppe had felt his blood turn to ice, but he maintained his dignity, standing to leave. "I built this business with these hands," he said, showing them palms scarred by years of hard labor. "No amount of money will make me sell it." The man smiled, but it held no warmth. "Money ain't the only currency we deal in, friend." Now 3 months later, as Christmas Eve deepened into night, Giuseppe tried to push those memories away. His family was safe under his roof. The doors were locked, the windows secured. Tomorrow would bring Christmas morning, and with it, the joy of watching his children's faces light up with wonder. At 12:30 a.m. on Christmas morning, the family began settling down for the night. The older children helped clean up the remnants of their evening preparations while Maria tucked the younger ones into their beds. The house gradually grew quiet, filled only with the settling sounds of old wood and the whisper of wind through the bare December trees. Giuseppe made his final rounds, checking the locks on the doors and ensuring the fire in the kitchen stove was properly banked. As he climbed the creaking stairs to the second floor, he felt a strange unease, a premonition that seemed to crawl up his spine like cold fingers. He paused at the top of the stairs, listening to the night sounds, but heard only the gentle breathing of his sleeping children. The fire began sometime between 1. Maria was the first to smell smoke. She woke with a start, her mother's instinct screaming danger, before her mind could fully process what was happening. The acrid scent filled her nostrils, and when she opened her bedroom door, she was met with a wall of heat that nearly knocked her backward. "Giuseppe," she screamed, shaking her husband awake. "Fire! The house is on fire!" The next few minutes unfolded with the terrible clarity that only true catastrophe can bring. Giuseppe leaped from bed and rushed to wake the children whose bedrooms were on the first floor. The smoke was already thick, pouring up from below like a living thing. But they managed to rouse James, Helen, and little Betty, hustling them outside into the freezing night air. But the second floor was already an inferno. The wooden stairs had become a chimney, funneling flames and superheated air upward with horrifying efficiency. Giuseppe tried 3 times to reach the second floor, where 5 of his children slept, but the heat drove him back each time, singeing his hair and eyebrows, filling his lungs with smoke that tasted of ash and despair. "The ladder!" Maria screamed over the roar of the flames. "Get the ladder from the barn." Giuseppe ran through the snow in his bare feet, his lungs burning, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. But when he reached the barn, the ladder that had always hung on the east wall was gone. In its place, neat cut marks in the wood showed where someone had deliberately sawed through the supports, leaving only splintered remnants. Someone had prepared for this night. By the time Giuseppe returned to the house, the second floor was completely engulfed. The windows glowed like the eyes of a demon, and the heat was so intense that the snow melted in a wide circle around the building. Maria stood in her nightgown, clutching Betty to her chest while Helen and James held each other, all of them screaming the names of the children trapped above. "Louis, Martha, Dorothy, call for help!" But their voices were lost in the howling of the flames. The volunteer fire department received the call at 1:45 a.m., but what happened next would haunt the investigation for decades to come. The fire truck, which had been in perfect working condition just days before, refused to start. When the firemen finally arrived using an older backup truck, they found their water source frozen solid, a hydrant that had been working perfectly in the warmer weather of the previous week. By 3:00 a.m., the house was gone. Nothing remained but a smoldering foundation and the twisted metal remnants of beds and furniture. The heat had been so intense that even the brick chimney had partially collapsed, leaving a scene of destruction so complete it seemed impossible that anything could have survived. As dawn broke gray and cold over the ruins, Giuseppe and Maria stood with their 3 surviving children, staring at the blackened hole where their lives had been. Neighbors began arriving with blankets and offers of shelter, their faces drawn with the kind of grief that comes from witnessing unthinkable loss. But it was what they didn't find that would transform this tragedy into a mystery that would consume the next 40 years of their lives. There were no bodies. The fire chief, a gruff man named William Hayes, who had fought blazes for over 20 years, walked through the cooled ashes with growing bewilderment. House fires, even the most destructive ones, always left something behind: bones, teeth, metal objects that would have been on or near the victims. But despite hours of careful searching, they found nothing that suggested 5 children had perished in the flames. "I have seen fires hot enough to cremate a body," Hayes told Giuseppe, his voice heavy with confusion. "But this don't make sense. There should be something. Always is." The state fire investigator arrived 2 days later, a thin man with sharp eyes named Thomas Cranston, who had built his reputation on solving impossible cases. He spent 3 days sifting through every inch of ash and debris, using techniques that were advanced for his final report would raise more questions than it answered. The fire had burned unusually hot for a residential blaze, reaching temperatures that seemed impossible given the available fuel sources. The pattern of burn damage suggested the use of an accelerant, possibly gasoline, though no traces could be definitively identified in the ashes. Most disturbing of all, Cranston found evidence that the fire had started in multiple locations simultaneously, a clear sign of arson. Someone wanted this house to burn fast and complete, Cranston told Giuseppe in a private meeting. Question is, why? And where are your children? The investigation that followed revealed a web of circumstances that seemed too coincidental to be natural, yet too bizarre to be the work of normal criminals. The telephone lines to the house had been cut sometime before the fire began, making it impossible for the family to call for help. The Castellanos' truck, which Giuseppe could have used to drive to town for assistance, had been tampered with sugar poured into the gas tank, rendering it inoperable. Most chilling of all were the witness accounts that began surfacing in the days after the fire. Mrs. Patricia Jennings, who lived in a house with a clear view of the Castellano property, reported seeing a strange car parked on the hill overlooking the house for several hours on Christmas Eve. The vehicle had no license plates that she could make out, and when she looked again after the fire started, it was gone. Tommy Morrison, a local teenager returning home from a Christmas party, claimed he saw 5 children standing in the upper windows of the burning house, but they appeared to be looking out calmly, as if watching something rather than trying to escape. When he looked again moments later, the windows were empty. Most disturbing was the account of Reverend Phillips from the nearby Methodist church. He reported that a woman had called him around midnight on Christmas Eve, claiming to have seen men loading children into a large truck near the Castellano property. She was too frightened to give her name and hung up before he could get more details. As word of these accounts spread through Fayetteville, public opinion began to shift. What had initially appeared to be a tragic house fire was beginning to look like something far more sinister, a carefully orchestrated kidnapping disguised as an accident. Giuseppe threw himself into the investigation with the desperate energy of a man who refused to accept the loss of his children. He hired private detectives, offered rewards, and followed every lead no matter how unlikely. Maria, meanwhile, seemed to age a decade in the space of weeks, her dark hair turning gray as she clung to the belief that her children were still alive somewhere, waiting for their parents to find them. The FBI was eventually called in, bringing resources and expertise that the local authorities lacked. Special Agent Robert Milliken, a methodical man with a reputation for solving complex kidnapping cases, spent months interviewing witnesses, analyzing evidence, and pursuing leads that stretched from West Virginia to New York City. Milliken's investigation uncovered connections that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Giuseppe's trucking business had indeed attracted attention from organized crime syndicates looking to expand their operations into coal country. The men who had approached him months earlier were identified as associates of the Torino crime family, a brutal organization that controlled trucking and construction contracts throughout the mid-Atlantic region. But the trail grew cold whenever investigators tried to establish direct links between the crime family and the Christmas Eve fire. The Torinos had alibis, witnesses, and lawyers who made sure no definitive connections could be proven. It was as if the fire had been carried out by ghosts, carefully planned, expertly executed, and impossible to trace. As winter turned to spring, the case began to fade from public attention. The FBI investigation was quietly closed due to lack of evidence, though Milliken privately told Giuseppe that he believed the children had been taken alive as a message to other businessmen who might resist the syndicate's expansion. They wanted to make an example, Milliken said during their final meeting, but they also knew killing children outright would bring too much heat. My guess is they took them somewhere far away, maybe even out of the country. Giuseppe refused to give up. He mortgaged what remained of his property to fund continued investigations, placing advertisements in newspapers across the country with photographs of his missing children. He followed leads to Chicago, New York, even as far as Florida, chasing shadows and whispers that never led anywhere concrete. The family rebuilt their home on the same foundation where the original house had stood, but it was never the same. The 3 surviving children struggled with survivor's guilt and the constant uncertainty about their siblings' fate. Helen married young and moved to California. Unable to bear the weight of staying in Fayetteville, James tried to take over his father's trucking business, but found it impossible to concentrate on mundane concerns while his brothers and sisters remained missing. By 1950, 5 years after the fire, the case had officially gone cold. Giuseppe continued his private investigation, but the leads had dwindled to nothing. The family had received hundreds of letters claiming to have information about the missing children, but each one proved to be either a cruel hoax or a case of mistaken identity. The town of Fayetteville gradually moved on, as towns do after tragedy. New families moved into the area. Children who had not known Louis, Maurice, Martha, and Dorothy grew up and had children of their own. The Castellano fire became a local legend, the kind of story that was told in hushed voices around kitchen tables and campfires. But Giuseppe never stopped believing his children were alive. He kept their rooms exactly as they had been on Christmas Eve 1945, their clothes hanging in closets, their toys arranged on shelves, their beds made with crisp sheets as if they might return at any moment. Maria would sometimes be found sitting in Dorothy's room, staring out the window at the hills beyond, humming the Christmas carols her daughter had played on the piano that last night. The years stretched on, marked by birthdays that were celebrated in absence, and Christmases that brought only painful reminders. Giuseppe's hair turned white, his back bent from the weight of carrying hope that grew heavier with each passing year. Maria developed a heart condition that the doctors attributed to stress, though the family knew it was really a condition of the soul, a heart broken by loss and sustained only by the possibility of reunion. In 1960, 15 years after the fire, Giuseppe made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He erected a billboard along Route 16, the main highway through Fayetteville, featuring photographs of his 5 missing children and offering a reward for any information about their whereabouts. The billboard became a landmark, a stark reminder that some mysteries refused to fade quietly into history. Local teenagers would dare each other to spend nights near the ruins of the original Castellano house, claiming they could still smell smoke in the air and hear children's voices calling from the darkness. Whether these stories were real or imagined, they kept the memory of the missing children alive in the community's collective consciousness. As the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, Giuseppe's health began to fail. The doctors diagnosed him with emphysema, likely caused by the smoke he had inhaled during his desperate attempts to save his children. Maria's heart condition worsened, requiring frequent hospitalizations that left Giuseppe alone in the house, with too much time to remember and too little strength to continue his search. But even as his body weakened, Giuseppe's resolve never wavered. He had converted one room of the rebuilt house into a command center for his investigation, its walls covered with maps, photographs, newspaper clippings, and theories written in his careful handwriting. He corresponded with private detectives, psychics, and amateur sleuths from around the country, following even the most far-fetched leads with the dedication of a man who had nothing left to lose. It was during this period that the strange phone calls began again. The first call came on Christmas Eve, 1967, exactly 22 years after the fire. Giuseppe was alone in the house, Maria having been hospitalized earlier that week with chest pains. The phone rang just after midnight, and when Giuseppe answered, he heard only breathing on the other end. But there was something about that breathing, something familiar that made his heart race. "Who is this?" he whispered into the phone. The breathing continued for nearly a minute before the line went dead. The calls continued sporadically over the next several years, always on significant dates: Christmas Eve, the children's birthdays, the anniversary of the fire. Giuseppe began recording the calls on a small tape recorder, analyzing them for any clue that might reveal the caller's identity or location. The breathing patterns were consistent, suggesting it was always the same person, but the calls were too brief to trace. In 1970, a private detective Giuseppe had hired received a tip from an anonymous source, claiming to have seen a woman who resembled Martha, the youngest of the missing Castellano daughters, working as a waitress in a truck stop outside of Baltimore. Giuseppe and Maria, despite her frail health, made the journey to Maryland, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. The woman did indeed bear a striking resemblance to how Martha might look at 32 years old. She had the same dark eyes, the same delicate bone structure, even a similar way of moving that made Maria gasp and reach for Giuseppe's arm. But when they approached her, the woman looked at them with genuine confusion, providing identification that proved she was someone else entirely, a cruel coincidence that left the couple devastated. Similar false alarms occurred throughout the 1970s, each one raising hopes only to dash them against the rocks of reality. Giuseppe began to wonder if the calls and sightings were part of an elaborate torture designed to keep the family in a state of perpetual anguish. But he could not bring himself to stop following the leads, because somewhere in his heart he still believed that one of them might be real. The billboard on Route 16 had become weathered and faded by the late 1970s, its colors bleached by sun and rain until the photographs of the children were barely visible. Giuseppe wanted to replace it, but his finances had been exhausted by decades of private investigations. The trucking business had been sold years earlier to pay for detectives and reward money, leaving the family dependent on Giuseppe's small pension and Maria's social security. It was in this context of fading hope and depleted resources that the most significant development in the case occurred. In November 1979, 34 years after the fire, Giuseppe received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph and a note written in block letters that said simply, "They are well. Do not search anymore." The photograph showed a group of young adults standing in front of what appeared to be a large house or institution. The image was slightly out of focus, but Giuseppe studied it with a magnifying glass until his eyes ached. 4 of the 5 figures bore unmistakable resemblances to his missing children, as they might look as adults. The 5th figure was turned away from the camera, but something about the posture and build suggested it could be Dorothy. Giuseppe took the photograph to every expert he could find: handwriting analysts, photo specialists, even FBI agents who had worked on the original case. The consensus was that the image appeared genuine, not doctored or composed, but the quality made definitive identification impossible. The paper and processing techniques suggested the photo had been taken recently, not decades earlier. The postmark on the package was from Kentucky, but efforts to trace its origin led nowhere. Giuseppe hired his last private detective, a young man named David Walsh, who specialized in missing persons cases, to investigate the photograph's origins. Walsh spent months following leads throughout Kentucky and the surrounding states, but found no trace of the mysterious photographer or the subjects in the image. As 1979 drew to a close, Giuseppe faced a terrible decision. The photograph had given him the first concrete evidence in decades that his children might still be alive, but the accompanying message seemed to suggest that continued searching might put them in danger. The man who had spent 34 years refusing to give up hope was being asked to choose between his desperate need to know and his children's possible safety. The internal struggle nearly destroyed him. Giuseppe would sit for hours staring at the photograph, comparing the faces to the last pictures he had of his children, looking for definitive proof that would make his decision easier. Maria, now confined to a wheelchair and dependent on oxygen, could offer little guidance. Her mind had begun to wander in recent months, sometimes speaking to the missing children as if they were still in the house, sometimes forgetting they were gone at all. Winter settled over West Virginia with unusual severity in 1979, bringing snowstorms that isolated the rebuilt Castellano house for days at a time. Giuseppe found himself increasingly alone with his thoughts and his terrible choice. The photograph sat on his kitchen table like an accusation, its blurry faces seeming to watch him with expressions he could not read. On Christmas Eve 1979, exactly 34 years after the fire, Giuseppe made his decision. He would wait. The waiting nearly killed him. Giuseppe Castellano had endured 34 years of uncertainty, but the months following his decision to stop actively searching brought a different kind of torment. The mysterious photograph remained on his kitchen table, its edges growing soft from his constant handling, its faces becoming as familiar as his own reflection. Every morning, he would study those blurred features with the desperate hope of discovering some detail he had missed, some proof that would definitively identify the figures as his lost children. Maria's condition deteriorated rapidly through the winter of 1980. The combination of heart disease and what doctors now recognized as early-stage dementia left her increasingly disconnected from reality. She would wake in the night calling for Dorothy to practice her piano lessons, or asking Giuseppe to help Louis with his arithmetic homework. During her lucid moments, she would stare at the photograph with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, whispering names like a prayer. "They look so sad," she told Giuseppe one gray February morning, her voice barely audible over the hiss of her oxygen machine. "Why do they look so sad, Giuseppe? What did those men do to our babies?" Giuseppe had no answer. The faces in the photograph were too indistinct to read expressions clearly, but Maria seemed to see something in them that escaped him. Perhaps it was a mother's intuition, or perhaps it was the gradual dissolution of the boundary between hope and delusion that comes with prolonged grief. Spring brought an unexpected development that would shatter Giuseppe's fragile peace. David Walsh, the young private detective Giuseppe had hired to investigate the photograph, appeared at the rebuilt house on a rainy April morning, with news that sent electricity through the old man's veins. Walsh had discovered something that the FBI, state investigators, and dozens of private detectives had missed over the decades, a pattern hidden in plain sight. "Mr. Castellano," Walsh said, spreading a collection of newspaper clippings across the kitchen table beside the photograph, "I think your children weren't the only ones taken." The clippings dated back to the 1940s and stretched through the 1970s, each one documenting a mysterious disappearance or suspected kidnapping involving children from families who had refused to cooperate with organized crime syndicates. A baker in Pittsburgh, whose 3 children vanished after he refused to pay protection money. A dock worker in Baltimore, whose twin daughters disappeared following his testimony against union corruption. A restaurant owner in Cleveland, whose son was never seen again after he declined to launder money through his business. The pattern was subtle, carefully designed to avoid detection by law enforcement agencies that rarely shared information across jurisdictions. But Walsh had spent months cross-referencing missing persons reports with FBI files on organized crime activities, and the connections were undeniable. The Torino crime family, the same organization that had pressured Giuseppe to sell his trucking business, appeared to be connected to dozens of disappearances spanning 3 decades. "They are not killers," Walsh explained, his young face animated with the excitement of discovery. "At least, not when it comes to children. They are traffickers. They take the kids as leverage to control the parents, and then they disappear them into some kind of network. Look at this." Walsh produced a map of the eastern United States, marked with red pins, indicating each suspected kidnapping. The pins formed a rough corridor stretching from New York City south to Georgia, with concentrations around major cities and transportation hubs. At the center of this corridor, like the hub of a wheel, sat a small town in eastern Kentucky called Millbrook. "I found property records showing the Torino family owns a large estate outside Millbrook," Walsh continued. "It was purchased in 1946, just months after your children disappeared. The property includes a main house, several outbuildings, and over 500 acres of isolated woodland. If your kids were taken alive, that's where they would be." Giuseppe felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he studied the map. Millbrook was less than 200 miles from Fayetteville, close enough that the mysterious photograph could have been mailed from there within the time frame of its postmark. The proximity felt like a cruel joke. His children had possibly been within driving distance for over 30 years, while he searched the entire country for traces of them. But Walsh's next revelation was even more disturbing. "Mr. Castellano, I need to prepare you for something difficult. If your children are still alive, they may not be the same people who were taken in 35 years of captivity, especially starting in childhood, can fundamentally change a person's identity, their loyalties, their entire sense of self. The implications of Walsh's words settled over Giuseppe like a shroud. His missing children would now be adults in their 40s and 50s. If they had been raised by their captors, they might not even remember their original family. They might have been told their parents were dead, or worse, that their parents had sold them. The children he had spent decades searching for might no longer exist, replaced by strangers wearing familiar faces. That night, Giuseppe made the most difficult decision of his life. Despite the anonymous warning to stop searching, despite the potential danger to his children, he had to know the truth. He authorized Walsh to conduct a careful reconnaissance of the Kentucky property, with strict instructions to avoid any direct contact that might endanger the missing children. Walsh departed for Kentucky on May 15, 1980, carrying with him high-powered binoculars, a telephoto camera, and 35 years' worth of desperate hope. Giuseppe waited at home, tending to Maria and staring at the telephone as if his concentrated attention could make it ring with good news. 3 weeks passed in agonizing silence. When Walsh finally returned, his face told the story before his words could. He had found something at the Kentucky estate, but it was not what anyone had expected or hoped for. "The property is abandoned," Walsh reported, his voice heavy with exhaustion and disappointment. "Has been for several years, maybe longer. The main house is falling apart, the outbuildings are collapsing, and there's no sign that anyone has lived there recently." Giuseppe felt the familiar crushing weight of another dead end, but Walsh wasn't finished. "However, I did find this." Walsh produced a small metal object that made Giuseppe's breath catch in his throat. It was a saint's medal, tarnished with age and weather, but still recognizable as the St. Christopher pendant that Dorothy had worn every day since her first communion. Giuseppe had given it to her himself, and he remembered how she had touched it nervously whenever she was frightened or upset. "I found it near the foundation of what used to be a large barn," Walsh explained. "There were also He spread out photographs taken with the telephoto lens, showing the ruins of the barn and the overgrown fields beyond. But it was the aerial shots that made Giuseppe's hands shake. Visible from above were the faint geometric patterns of what had once been a substantial compound, multiple buildings arranged around a central courtyard, with cleared paths connecting them to a network of smaller structures scattered throughout the surrounding woods. "This wasn't just a hideout," Walsh said grimly. "This was an installation, a place designed to house dozens of people for extended periods. And based on the foundation sizes and the arrangement of the buildings, I'd say it was designed specifically for children." The revelation that his children had likely been imprisoned in such a place filled Giuseppe with a rage so pure it felt like poison in his veins. But the compound's abandonment raised new questions that were even more torturous than the old ones. If the children had been held there, where were they now? Had they been moved to another location? Or had something worse happened to them? Walsh had one more piece of evidence that would haunt Giuseppe for years to come. "I found a local historian who remembers the place being active through the 1960s and into the early 1970s. He said it was some kind of private school or religious retreat, though no one in town knew exactly what went on there. The property was surrounded by high fences and posted with no trespassing signs. But here's the interesting part: he remembers seeing children there. Lots of them, though they were never seen in town or at local schools." The historian had also provided a crucial piece of information about the property's abandonment. In 1975, exactly 30 years after the Castellano fire, local authorities had received reports of a massive fire at the Kentucky compound. By the time volunteer firefighters arrived, several buildings were completely destroyed, and the survivors had evacuated the remaining structures. The fire department report lists it as an accidental electrical fire, Walsh said, but the timing is suspicious. 1975 was when the FBI started cracking down hard on organized crime families. The Torinos were facing multiple indictments, and several high-ranking members were cooperating with federal prosecutors. My guess is they burned the compound to destroy evidence and moved their operation somewhere else. Giuseppe absorbed this information with the methodical patience of a man who had learned to process devastating news in small doses. The discovery of Dorothy's medal proved his children had been held at the Kentucky compound, but its abandonment meant the trail had gone cold once again. Worse, the possibility that his children had been moved or eliminated during the 1975 fire created a new category of nightmare to explore. Maria died in her sleep on June 3, 1980, exactly 6 months after Giuseppe had decided to wait rather than continue his active search. Her heart, already weakened by decades of grief, had simply stopped beating sometime in the early morning hours. Giuseppe found her still holding a faded photograph of all 10 children taken at Christmas 1944. Her fingers curled protectively around their faces as if she could shield them from harm even in death. The funeral was small but deeply moving, attended by neighbors who remembered Maria's grace under impossible circumstances. Reverend Phillips, now in his 80s but still serving the Methodist Church, spoke of Maria's unwavering faith that she would be reunited with her missing children in heaven. Giuseppe sat in the front pew, dry-eyed and hollow, feeling as if another piece of his soul had been torn away. Alone now in the rebuilt house, Giuseppe found himself talking to Maria's ghost as much as he had talked to her living presence. He would describe his plans for continuing the search, ask her opinion about leads to follow, and sometimes just sit in her favorite chair and tell her about his day as if she was still there to listen. The mysterious phone calls resumed shortly after Maria's death, but now they carried a different quality. The breathing on the other end seemed more labored, older, and sometimes Giuseppe thought he could hear whispered words too faint to understand. He began staying awake at night, waiting by the telephone with his tape recorder, hoping to capture something that might provide a new clue. On Christmas Eve, 1980, 35 years after the fire, the call that came was different from all the others. Instead of breathing, Giuseppe heard a woman's voice, distorted by distance and static, speaking words that made his heart stop. "Papa?" The connection was poor, full of crackling interference that made it difficult to be certain, but the voice carried an inflection that Giuseppe recognized from decades of memory. It was Dorothy, or someone who sounded remarkably like Dorothy would sound as a middle-aged woman. "Dorothy, Dorothy, is that you?" Giuseppe's voice cracked with emotion as he pressed the telephone receiver against his ear, straining to hear through the static. The line went dead. Giuseppe called the phone company immediately, begging them to trace the call, but the technology of 1980 made such efforts nearly impossible, especially for calls that lasted only seconds. He spent the rest of the night replaying the recording he had made, listening to those 2 words over and over, until they became meaningless sounds. But doubt crept in with the dawn. Had it really been Dorothy's voice, or was it his desperate mind creating meaning from random noise? The word "Papa" had been spoken with an accent that seemed wrong somehow, as if English were not the speaker's primary language. Dorothy had been only 14 when she disappeared, fluent in both English and Italian. Would 35 years of captivity have changed her speech patterns so dramatically? The uncertainty was maddening, but it reignited Giuseppe's determination to find the truth. He hired Walsh for another investigation, this time focusing on tracing the source of the mysterious phone calls. Walsh brought in technical experts who installed sophisticated recording equipment in Giuseppe's house, devices that could capture and analyze even the faintest transmissions. The next call came on Dorothy's birthday in February 1981. This time the voice was clearer, and the words were more extensive. "Papa, we are alive. Do not come looking. It is not safe. We remember you." The recording was analyzed by voice experts who confirmed that the speaker was likely a middle-aged woman with traces of both Italian and Appalachian accents, exactly what Dorothy's speech might sound like after decades in Kentucky. But they also identified background sounds that provided new clues: the distant sound of machinery, possibly textile equipment, and what appeared to be other voices speaking in languages that included Italian, English, and something that might have been Spanish or Portuguese. Walsh used this information to expand his investigation into textile mills and manufacturing facilities throughout Kentucky and the surrounding states. The Torino crime family had legitimate business interests in several industries, including garment manufacturing, and they owned or controlled dozens of factories across the region. The breakthrough came in March 1981, when Walsh discovered a connection that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. The Torino family owned a controlling interest in Millbrook Textiles, a large manufacturing complex located just outside the town where the abandoned compound had been found. More significantly, company records showed that the textile mill had been established in 1946, the same year the Kentucky compound was purchased, and just months after the Castellano children disappeared. Walsh conducted surveillance of the textile mill and made a discovery that sent chills through both him and Giuseppe. The factory operated using what appeared to be a captive workforce, with company-owned housing that resembled a prison more than normal employee accommodation. Workers were transported to and from the factory in unmarked buses, lived in heavily secured dormitories, and were never seen in the town of Millbrook itself. Most disturbing of all, Walsh observed that many of the workers appeared to be of mixed ethnicity and various ages, suggesting a population that included people who had been there for different lengths of time. Some of the older workers moved with the resigned shuffle of people who had given up hope of ever leaving, while younger ones displayed the nervous alertness of more recent arrivals. "I think we found them," Walsh told Giuseppe during a late-night meeting in the rebuilt house. "Or at least, we found where they have been held since." The textile mill is the perfect cover. It provides a legitimate reason for housing large numbers of workers in controlled conditions, and it generates enough revenue to sustain the operation indefinitely. But approaching the mill directly would be incredibly dangerous. The Torino family had survived decades of FBI investigations by being ruthless in eliminating threats, and any overt attempt to rescue the captives would likely result in their disappearance or death. Giuseppe faced the same terrible choice he had confronted after receiving the mysterious photograph: his desperate need to save his children versus the risk that his actions might destroy them. The decision was made for him by events beyond his control. On April 15, 1981, federal agents raided Millbrook Textiles as part of a massive organized crime sweep that targeted Torino operations across 5 states. Giuseppe learned about the raid from television news, watching in agonizing suspense as reporters described the liberation of over 200 workers who had been held in conditions resembling slavery. But when the list of rescued workers was released, none of the names matched Giuseppe's missing children. Walsh contacted his sources in law enforcement and learned that many of the rescued workers had been too traumatized to provide reliable information about their identities or origins. Some claimed to have been at the mill for decades, but could not or would not discuss their lives before captivity. Others seemed to have been conditioned not to trust authority figures and refused to cooperate with investigators. Most troubling of all was the discovery that the mill's records had been systematically destroyed before the raid. Computer files had been wiped, paper documents had been burned, and even the payroll systems had been sabotaged. It was as if the Torino family had known the raid was coming and had taken steps to prevent their captives from being identified or reconnected with their original families. Giuseppe traveled to Kentucky immediately, despite his advanced age and failing health. He visited the temporary shelters where the rescued workers were being housed, showing photographs of his children to anyone who would look. Most of the former captives recoiled from any mention of the past, but a few seemed to recognize the faces in Giuseppe's worn photographs. An elderly man who claimed to have been at the mill since the 1950s pulled Giuseppe aside after looking at the pictures. "I remember children who looked like these," he whispered, glancing nervously around the shelter. "They were special ones, kept separate from the rest of us. The bosses called them insurance policies, but they are not here anymore. Where are they? Giuseppe asked, his voice barely controlled. Gone, the man replied. Moved years ago when the heat got too much. They took the special ones somewhere safe, somewhere the law couldn't reach. The man claimed that the special ones had been relocated to a facility outside the United States, possibly in Mexico or Central America, where the Torino family maintained business interests beyond the reach of American law enforcement. But he had no specific information about locations or timing, and his mental state seemed fragile after decades of captivity. Giuseppe returned to West Virginia with more questions than answers. The raid on Millbrook Textiles had confirmed that his children had likely been held there for several years, but it had also revealed that they had been moved again, possibly to a location where he would never be able to find them. The investigation continued through 1981 and into 1982, with Walsh following increasingly tenuous leads to Mexico, Panama, and other Central American countries where the Torino family maintained connections. But each lead dissolved into rumor and speculation, and the trail grew colder with each passing month. Giuseppe's health began to fail noticeably as the stress of the investigation took its toll. He had developed the same emphysema that had plagued his later years, and his doctor warned that continued stress could be fatal. But Giuseppe could not bring himself to stop searching, especially now that he had proof his children had survived into adulthood. The final breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In September 1982, Giuseppe received a visit from a woman who introduced herself as Angela Torino, the estranged daughter of the crime family's patriarch. Angela had broken away from her family years earlier and had been living under an assumed name in California. But recent events had prompted her to contact Giuseppe with information she claimed could lead him to his children. "My father is dying," Angela told Giuseppe as they sat in his kitchen, the same room where he had spent decades analyzing clues and chasing shadows. "Cancer. He knows he doesn't have long, and he's been trying to clean up some of the family's older business. He sent me to make you an offer." The offer was both simple and devastating in its implications. Vincent Torino, the aging head of the crime family, was willing to provide information about the location of Giuseppe's children in exchange for a guarantee that Giuseppe would never reveal what he learned to law enforcement. It was, Angela explained, a final act of mercy from a man who wanted to die with at least one less sin on his conscience. "He respects what you have been through," Angela continued. "Losing children, it's something he understands. His own son was killed by a rival family in 1963, and it changed him. He never wanted your kids to be hurt, just controlled. But things got complicated over the years, and now he wants to make it right." Giuseppe studied Angela's face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. She appeared to be in her 40s, with the kind of expensive clothes and careful grooming that suggested wealth and sophistication. But her eyes held a sadness that seemed genuine, and her hands shook slightly as she spoke about her family's crimes. "What does he want from me?" Giuseppe asked. "Just your word that you will let sleeping dogs lie after you find them. No police, no FBI, no public exposure. You get your children back, and the family gets to fade into history without a final scandal." The moral complexity of the offer tormented Giuseppe for days. Accepting it would mean allowing the Torino family to escape justice for decades of kidnapping and exploitation. But refusing it might mean never seeing his children again, or worse, ensuring that they remained trapped wherever they were now being held. On October 1st, 1982, almost exactly 37 years after the Christmas Eve fire, Giuseppe gave Angela Torino his word. 3 days later, she returned with an address in Guatemala and a warning that would chill Giuseppe's blood for the remainder of his days. "They are not the same people you remember," Angela said as she prepared to leave. 37 years of captivity changes a person in ways you can't imagine. They may not want to come home. They may not even remember what home means. The address led to a place that existed beyond the reach of hope. Giuseppe Castellano's hands trembled as he held the piece of paper, Angela Torino had given him an address in the Guatemalan highlands that represented the culmination of 37 years of desperate searching. At 84 years old, with emphysema ravaging his lungs and his body weakened by decades of grief, the journey to Central America would likely be his last significant act on Earth. David Walsh tried to dissuade him from making the trip alone. The region Angela had described was politically unstable, with recent civil wars having left much of rural Guatemala under the control of military strongmen and criminal organizations. For an elderly American to travel there unprotected would be dangerous under normal circumstances, but Giuseppe was not seeking normal circumstances. "If my children are there, I'm going," Giuseppe told Walsh with a finality that brooked no argument. "I have waited 37 years. I won't die without seeing their faces." Walsh understood that no amount of reasonable objection would change the old man's mind, so instead he arranged for reliable transportation and hired a local guide who could navigate both the treacherous mountain roads and the complex web of corrupted officials who controlled passage through the region. The flight from Charleston to Guatemala City took 12 hours, with connections in Miami and Mexico City that left Giuseppe exhausted and struggling to breathe in the thin air. But when he finally stepped off the plane into the humid tropical night, he felt more alive than he had in years. After nearly 4 decades of chasing shadows and following dead ends, he was finally within reach of the truth. The guide Walsh had arranged turned out to be a weathered man in his 50s named Carlos Mendoza, who spoke fluent English and claimed to have connections throughout the northern highlands. Carlos took one look at Giuseppe's frail condition and shook his head grimly. "Señor, where we are going is not a place for old men," Carlos said, as they loaded into a battered Toyota pickup truck. "The roads are dangerous, the altitude is difficult, and the people we will encounter do not welcome strangers." "Then we will have to make sure we don't seem like strangers," Giuseppe replied, showing Carlos a photograph of Vincent Torino that Angela had provided. "This man owns property where we are going. His family has business there. That should be enough to get us past most obstacles." The journey into the mountains took 2 days of hard driving over roads that seemed more like suggestions carved into the mountainside. Giuseppe's breathing became increasingly labored as they climbed higher, and Carlos had to stop frequently to allow the old man to rest and use the portable oxygen tank Walsh had insisted he bring. But it was the gradual change in the landscape that truly took Giuseppe's breath away. As they climbed deeper into the cloud forests of northern Guatemala, the terrain began to resemble the hills of West Virginia, where he had raised his family. The same rolling mountains shrouded in mist, the same dense forests broken by small clearings, even the same quality of light filtering through the trees. It was as if his children had been hidden in a place designed to remind them of home, while keeping them forever separated from it. The address Angela had provided led to a compound nestled in a valley between 2 heavily forested peaks. Unlike the abandoned ruins of the Kentucky facility, this place was clearly active and well-maintained. High walls surrounded a collection of modern buildings arranged around a central courtyard, with satellite dishes and power lines indicating a level of infrastructure that seemed impossible in such a remote location. Carlos parked the truck on a ridge, overlooking the compound, and handed Giuseppe a pair of binoculars. "This is as close as we get without announcing ourselves," he said. "What you see down there is not a normal place. Too much security, too much isolation. Whatever business the Torino family has here, it's not something they want the world to know about." Giuseppe studied the compound through the binoculars, his heart hammering against his ribs as he searched for any sign of his missing children. The buildings were arranged in a pattern that suggested both residential and industrial purposes, living quarters connected to workshops or manufacturing facilities. People moved between the buildings with the purposeful efficiency of a well-organized community, but even from a distance, Giuseppe could see that they were surrounded by guards and surveillance equipment. "It's a prison," Giuseppe whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "They have built a beautiful prison in paradise and filled it with people who can never leave." Carlos nodded grimly. "Welcome to Guatemala, Señor. Land of the disappeared." They waited until darkness fell before making their approach to the compound. Carlos had studied the security arrangements and identified what appeared to be the weakest point: a service entrance used by supply trucks that accessed the facility through a narrow mountain road. The plan was simple but desperately dangerous. Carlos would create a distraction at the main gate while Giuseppe entered through the service entrance and searched for his children. "If you are not back in 1 hour, I leave without you," Carlos warned as they prepared to separate. "This place, these people, they do not forgive mistakes." Giuseppe understood the stakes, but after 37 years of searching, the possibility of death seemed less frightening than the prospect of returning home without answers. He checked the small recorder in his pocket, the same device he had used to capture the mysterious phone calls, and whispered a prayer to Maria's spirit for protection. The service entrance was guarded by a single man who appeared to be more interested in a portable radio than watching for intruders. Giuseppe waited in the shadows until the guard stepped away to relieve himself, then slipped through the gate and into the compound proper. What he found inside defied every expectation and shattered every assumption he had built over the decades of searching. The compound was not a prison in any conventional sense. The people moving between buildings were well-dressed, healthy-looking individuals who carried themselves with the confidence of people living normal, productive lives. Children played in courtyards while adults worked in gardens and workshops that produced goods, ranging from textiles to woodcrafts to electronic components. But it was the faces that made Giuseppe's breath catch in his throat. Moving through the compound with the assured familiarity of long-time residents were people who bore unmistakable resemblances to his missing children. A woman in her 50s with Dorothy's delicate features supervised a group of younger people working at looms in what appeared to be a textile workshop. A man who could only be Louis directed a construction crew repairing one of the residential buildings, his movements carrying the same purposeful efficiency that had characterized the 12-year-old boy Giuseppe remembered. Giuseppe pressed himself into the shadows between two buildings and watched this impossible scene unfold before him. His children were alive, healthy, and apparently thriving in this hidden community. But they were also clearly integral parts of an operation that extended far beyond simple captivity. The truth began to emerge as Giuseppe moved deeper into the compound. This was not just a place where kidnapped children had been held. It was a multi-generational community of people who had been systematically removed from their original lives and rebuilt into something entirely different. The older residents, people who appeared to be in their 50s and 60s, supervised younger adults and children in a complex hierarchy that resembled both a commune and a corporation. Giuseppe recognized the structure from his research into organized crime operations. The Torino family had not simply kidnapped children for ransom or leverage. They had created a sustainable workforce of people who had no legal identity, no connection to the outside world, and no choice but to remain loyal to the organization that controlled every aspect of their lives. His children had not been prisoners for 37 years. They had been converted. The realization hit Giuseppe like a physical blow. Dorothy, Louis, Maurice, and Martha had grown up in this place, had formed relationships and built lives within its confines, had possibly even had children of their own who knew no other existence. They were not victims waiting to be rescued. They were colonists in a carefully constructed alternative reality. Giuseppe found a vantage point in the shadows of what appeared to be the compound's administrative building and watched as the evening routine unfolded. Families gathered for communal meals in a large dining hall, children attended what appeared to be educational activities, and adults engaged in social interactions that seemed genuine and unstressed. But underlying this veneer of normalcy were the subtle signs of control that Giuseppe's decades of investigation had trained him to recognize. Guards positioned at key locations, surveillance cameras monitoring all activities, and most tellingly, the complete absence of any connection to the outside world. No newspapers, no television broadcasts, No radio communications that were not controlled by the compound's administration. It was then that Giuseppe saw her. Dorothy emerged from the administrative building carrying what appeared to be ledgers or accounting books. She was 51 years old now, her dark hair streaked with gray, her face lined with the experiences of a lifetime Giuseppe had not shared. But her posture, her way of moving, the particular tilt of her head when she was concentrating all of it, was exactly as he remembered from the 14-year-old girl who had played Christmas carols on the piano that last night in night. Giuseppe stepped out of the shadows before he could stop himself. Dorothy. She looked up from her ledgers, her eyes scanning the compound until they found his face. For a moment that seemed to stretch across decades, father and daughter stared at each other across the impossible distance of 37 years. Dorothy's expression cycled through confusion, recognition, and something that looked almost like fear before settling into a carefully neutral mask that Giuseppe had never seen her wear as a child. "You should not have come here," she said, her voice carrying the accent Angela Torino had warned him about. Italian and Appalachian sounds, filtered through decades of Spanish and whatever other languages had shaped her adult life. "Dorothy, it's me. It's Papa. I have been looking for you for 37 years. Dorothy glanced around the compound, clearly checking to see if their conversation was being observed. When she was satisfied that they were momentarily alone, she moved closer to Giuseppe, but her posture remained tense, defensive. "I know who you are," she said quietly. "We all know, we have known for years that you were searching, that you wouldn't give up. It's why we had to keep moving, why we could never be safe in one place for very long." The words hit Giuseppe like bullets. His decades of desperate searching had not been acts of love, they had been acts of persecution, forcing his children to live as fugitives from his unwillingness to accept their loss. "Dorothy, I want to take you home, all of you. We can be a family again." Dorothy's laugh was bitter, empty of any warmth. "Home? Papa, this is our home. This is our family. We have children here, grandchildren. We have responsibilities, commitments. We have lives. But you were kidnapped. You were taken from us. None of this is real. It's more real than the fantasy you have been living," Dorothy replied with a harshness that made Giuseppe flinch. "You think we have been sitting in cells for 37 years, waiting for you to rescue us? You think we haven't built relationships, made choices, created meaning in our lives?" Giuseppe struggled to process what he was hearing. This was not the reunion he had imagined during decades of sleepless nights. This was not the joyful return he had dreamed about during his darkest moments of despair. But the threats, the fire, the kidnapping were real, Dorothy confirmed. "We were taken because of your stubbornness, your refusal to cooperate with people who had the power to destroy us all. But that was 37 years ago, Papa. We were children then. We are not children anymore." As if summoned by their conversation, Giuseppe saw the familiar figures of Louis, Maurice, and Martha approaching from different directions. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of people who had worked together for decades, and Giuseppe realized that this meeting had been planned, anticipated, prepared for. Louis reached them first, and Giuseppe was startled by how much his son resembled Giuseppe's own father. The same heavy build, the same direct gaze, the same hands scarred by years of manual labor. "Hello, Papa," Louis said, his voice carrying no warmth but also no hostility. "We knew you would find us eventually. You always were the most stubborn man in West Virginia." Maurice and Martha arrived moments later, completing the impossible reunion that Giuseppe had dreamed about for nearly 4 decades. But the reality was nothing like the dream. His children stood before him not as the victims he had expected to rescue, but as middle-aged adults who regarded him with the polite distance reserved for unwelcome strangers. "Where is Betty?" Giuseppe asked, suddenly realizing that the youngest of his missing children was not among them. The question caused a visible reaction among his 4 adult children, a tightening around their eyes, a subtle shift in their postures that spoke of shared grief. "Betty died in 1963. Martha said softly. Pneumonia. She was only 23. The news hit Giuseppe with devastating force. While he had been searching for 5 missing children, he had actually been searching for 4 living adults and 1 daughter who had been dead for 20 years. All those leads he had followed, all those false hopes and crushing disappointments, all those nights spent staring at her photograph and wondering if she was safe. Betty had been gone for 2 decades. She's buried here, Dorothy added, gesturing toward a hill beyond the compound where Giuseppe could see the shapes of headstones among the trees. We visit her grave every year on Christmas Eve. Giuseppe felt his legs give way and had to steady himself against a nearby wall. The combination of altitude exhaustion and emotional shock was overwhelming his already fragile system. Papa, you need to sit down, Louis said, his voice carrying the first note of genuine concern Giuseppe had heard from any of his children. They helped him to a bench in the compound's central courtyard, and for a few minutes, Giuseppe simply sat and breathed, trying to process the magnitude of what he had discovered. His children were alive but not waiting for rescue. 1 daughter was dead, and had been for 20 years. The people he had spent his life trying to save had built new lives that did not include him. Why didn't you ever try to contact us? Giuseppe finally asked. Your mother died believing you were still alive but unable to come home. She died waiting for you. The question caused visible pain among his children, and Giuseppe saw tears in Martha's eyes for the first time since the reunion began. We tried, Dorothy said quietly. The phone calls, the photograph we sent in 1979, those were us, trying to let you know we were alive without endangering everyone here. But every time we made contact, it put the entire community at risk. Our safety, our children's safety, everyone's safety depended on staying hidden. We wanted you to stop searching, Maurice added. We wanted you to grieve us and move on, to build a life with Helen and James and Betty's memory. We never wanted you to waste 37 years chasing ghosts. Giuseppe understood now why Angela Torino had warned him that his children might not want to come home. They had not been held captive in any traditional sense. They had been absorbed into an alternative society that provided security, purpose, and community in exchange for absolute loyalty and complete severance from their previous lives. The Torino family didn't just kidnap children, Dorothy explained as the night deepened around them. They collected them. Specifically, they collected children from families who had something they wanted: businesses, properties, political connections. We were insurance policies that became investments. The compound, Giuseppe learned, was one of several similar facilities scattered throughout Central and South America, each one housing communities of people who had been systematically disappeared from their original lives and rebuilt into productive members of extended criminal enterprises. The residents were not prisoners in any conventional sense. They were shareholders in operations that generated enormous profits through legitimate businesses built on the foundation of their stolen labor and expertise. We are not victims anymore, Papa, Louis said with a pride that Giuseppe found both admirable and heartbreaking. We are partners. We own shares in textile mills, coffee plantations, electronics assembly plants. Our children go to universities. Our grandchildren will inherit properties and businesses. We have built something here. But Giuseppe could see the cage, even if his children could not. The compound might provide comfort and security, but it was still surrounded by walls and guards. His children might have built lives and relationships, but they had built them within the confines of an elaborate prison designed to make captivity feel like freedom. What about the others? Giuseppe asked. All the other children who were taken over the years. Most adapted, like we did, Martha replied. Some didn't survive, the weak ones, the ones who couldn't accept their new reality, and some, she paused, exchanging glances with her siblings, some were returned. Returned? The Torino family has been making amends over the years, Dorothy explained, quietly, carefully, without attracting attention from law enforcement. People who wanted to leave and had somewhere to go were allowed to leave, with new identities and financial support to help them rebuild their lives. Giuseppe felt a flicker of hope. You could leave. All of you. I could take you home. Home to what? Louis asked with a bitterness that reminded Giuseppe of his own father's voice. Home to a rebuilt house where everyone we knew is dead or gone. Home to a community that would never understand what we have become. Home to children and grandchildren who would be torn away from everything they have ever known. Giuseppe looked around the compound at the evidence of the lives his children had built. The workshops where they created products for global markets. The schools where they educated, not just their own children but the children of other displaced families. The gardens and common areas where multiple generations gathered for meals and celebrations. They had indeed built something here, something that might have been beautiful if it had been chosen rather than imposed. I'm dying, Giuseppe said quietly, the words carrying across the courtyard like a confession. My lungs are failing. My heart is weak. I came here because I needed to see your faces before I died. I needed to know what happened to you. His 4 surviving children exchanged looks that spoke of the deep communication that comes from decades of shared experience. Finally, Dorothy spoke for all of them. Papa, we love you. We never stopped loving you. Even when we were angry that your searching put us all in danger. But the people you are looking for, the children who were taken in 1945, those people don't exist anymore. We are who we became instead. Giuseppe understood. The children he had been searching for had died decades ago, not from fire or violence, but from the simple passage of time and the human capacity to adapt to impossible circumstances. The adults sitting with him were the people his children had grown into, shaped by experiences that Giuseppe could never understand or share. Can I meet them? Giuseppe asked. My grandchildren. The request seemed to break something loose in his adult children, and for the first time since the reunion began, Giuseppe saw genuine warmth in their faces. Over the next several hours, as the compound settled into its nighttime routine, Giuseppe was introduced to an extended family he had never known existed. Dorothy had 3 children and 6 grandchildren. Louis had 2 sons who ran a furniture workshop that supplied hotels throughout Central America. Maurice had married a woman from another displaced family and had built a successful electronics repair business. Martha had become the compound's primary teacher and had educated hundreds of children over the decades. They were accomplished, productive people who had built meaningful lives within the constraints of their stolen existence. They spoke multiple languages, had traveled throughout Central and South America on business for the Torino enterprises, and had created a complex network of relationships that extended far beyond the compound's walls. Giuseppe spent the entire night listening to stories about birthdays and graduations, marriages and births, achievements and disappointments that had occurred during the 37 years he had missed. His children showed him photographs of people and places he would never see, told him about traditions and celebrations that had developed organically within their alternative community. It was both the happiest and saddest night of Giuseppe's life. As dawn approached, bringing with it the reality that Giuseppe would have to leave and probably never see his children again, Dorothy made an unexpected offer. You could stay, she said quietly. There are other elderly residents here, other people who came to the end of their searching and chose to live out their final years with their families. The Torino organization has been evolving. They are less concerned with maintaining absolute control than they once were. Giuseppe considered the offer seriously. The compound offered medical facilities that could manage his emphysema, social connections that could ease his isolation, and most importantly, the opportunity to spend his remaining time with the family he had spent 37 years trying to find. But he also understood that staying would mean accepting the legitimacy of the system that had destroyed his original family. It would mean becoming complicit in the elaborate deception that had turned kidnapping into community, captivity into career development. I need to go home, Giuseppe said finally. Helen and James are still in West Virginia. They never stopped hoping their siblings were alive. And they deserve to know the truth. They deserve to know that you are safe and happy, even if you can never come home. Giuseppe's children accepted his decision with the same resigned grace they had shown throughout the long night of reunion and explanation. They helped him prepare for the journey back to Guatemala City, providing him with photographs of their families and letters to be delivered to Helen and James. But it was Dorothy who provided the most precious gift of all. "I want you to have this," she said, pressing something small and hard into Giuseppe's palm. It was the St. Christopher medal he had given her for her first communion, the same medal that had been found in the ruins of the Kentucky compound. "I have carried it every day for 37 years. It helped me remember where I came from, even when I was becoming someone else." Giuseppe closed his fingers around the tarnished medal and felt the weight of all the prayers Maria had said over the decades, all the candles she had lit in front of the statue of St. Christopher at their local church, all the hopes she had carried until her heart simply could not carry them anymore. The journey back to Guatemala City passed in a haze of exhaustion and emotion. Carlos, who had waited faithfully throughout the night, asked no questions about what Giuseppe had found at the compound. Some truths were too large and complex to be shared with strangers. Giuseppe used the long flight home to compose letters to Helen and James, explaining what he had discovered and preparing them for information that would fundamentally change their understanding of their family's tragedy. He also wrote a final letter to be delivered to David Walsh, containing instructions for closing the investigation that had defined the last decades of Giuseppe's life. The flight from Guatemala City to Charleston took 14 hours, but Giuseppe felt as if he were traveling not just through space, but through time, returning from a world that existed parallel to, but separate from the reality he had known for 84 years. Giuseppe Castellano died peacefully in his sleep on November 15, 1982, exactly 6 weeks after returning from Guatemala. Helen and James found him in his chair in the room that had served as his investigation headquarters, surrounded by maps and photographs and decades of accumulated evidence. In his lap was the St. Christopher medal Dorothy had returned to him, and on the table beside his chair was a sealed envelope amorced to the FBI. The envelope contained a complete account of Giuseppe's discoveries in Guatemala, along with his recommendation that the case of the missing Castellano children be officially closed. The letter explained that while the children had indeed been kidnapped in 1945, they had subsequently built new lives and chose to remain with their adopted families rather than return to West Virginia. Federal agents who read Giuseppe's account found it too incredible to believe and too detailed to dismiss. The descriptions of the Guatemalan compound matched intelligence reports about Torino family operations in Central America, but the suggestion that kidnapped children had been converted into willing participants in criminal enterprises was unprecedented in FBI experience. The case was quietly closed without further investigation, filed away in the vast archives of the federal bureaucracy, as another example of organized crime's capacity for both cruelty and complexity. Helen and James Castellano struggled with their father's revelations for years afterward. The knowledge that their siblings were alive but unreachable created a new category of grief that had no established rituals or support systems. They found themselves mourning not just the deaths of their childhood siblings, but also the lives those siblings had built in a world their original family could never enter. The billboard on Route 16, which had stood as a monument to Giuseppe's refusal to accept loss, was quietly removed by highway maintenance crews in the spring of 19. Local residents had grown so accustomed to its presence that many failed to notice its absence, but those who did remarked that the landscape looked somehow incomplete without it. The rebuilt Castellano house stood empty for several months after Giuseppe's death, before Helen and James decided to sell it to a young family from Ohio who knew nothing about its history. The new owners renovated the interior, painted over the decades of accumulated evidence that Giuseppe had written on the walls, and filled the rooms with the sounds of children who could sleep safely in their beds without fear of midnight flames. But sometimes on Christmas Eve, when snow falls gently across the hills of West Virginia and the wind carries the sound of distant caroling. Neighbors report seeing lights in the windows of the old Castellano house. They claim to hear the faint sound of piano music drifting across the winter air, playing melodies that seem both familiar and impossibly sad. The mystery of what happened on Christmas Eve 1945 was officially solved, but the truth turned out to be more complex and heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined. 5 children were indeed taken from their family that night, but they were not murdered or held in traditional captivity. Instead, they were absorbed into an alternative reality that provided security and purpose in exchange for the complete erasure of their original identities. Giuseppe Castellano spent 37 years searching for children who no longer existed, while the adults they had become built lives that their original family could never understand or share. It was a resolution that satisfied all the legal requirements for closure, while leaving the deeper questions about identity, loyalty, and the meaning of family forever unanswered. In the hills of Guatemala, 4 elderly siblings continued to visit a small cemetery every Christmas Eve, placing flowers on the grave of their sister Betty and remembering the parents they had loved but could never return to. They had found peace within the constraints of their stolen lives, but they carried the weight of that theft in ways that outsiders could never fully comprehend. The last known contact between the surviving Castellano siblings and their original family came in the form of a Christmas card sent to Helen's address in California in December 1995, exactly 50 years after the fire. The card contained no message, no signature, only a photograph showing 4 elderly people standing together in front of a mountain landscape, their faces worn by time but unmistakably familiar. Helen kept the photograph on her mantelpiece until her death in 2008, when it was found among her effects by grandchildren, who had no idea who the people in the picture were. The photograph was eventually donated to the Fayetteville Historical Society, where it remains in a file marked Unsolved Cases Castellano Fire. The case of the 5 missing Castellano children officially concluded with Giuseppe's death in 1982. But the questions it raised about identity, family, and the long-term effects of childhood trauma continue to resonate with investigators, sociologists, and anyone who has ever wondered how much of our essential self can be destroyed by circumstances beyond our control. Some mysteries are solved not by discovery, but by acceptance of the truth that some losses are too profound to be recovered, some separations too complete to be bridged, and some families too damaged to ever be whole again. The Castellano fire burned for one night in 1945, but its consequences rippled across decades, destroying not just a house but the very concept of home itself. In the end, Giuseppe Castellano found what he was looking for: his missing children, alive and safe after 37 years. But what he found was not what he had been searching for, and the reunion he had dreamed about turned out to be a farewell to people who had never really been lost, just transformed beyond recognition. The flames that consumed the Castellano house on Christmas Eve 1945 had indeed taken 5 children, but they had left behind 4 adults who learned to build new lives from the ashes of their stolen childhood. Whether that transformation represented a form of salvation or the deepest kind of tragedy depends entirely on whether you believe that